Welcome to Teolumen Insights, where we reveal the hidden forces that shape the way you live and show you how to use them to create real transformation and supercharge your health, mindset, and daily life. Here are your hosts, Emma Greenwood and Nathan Sinclaire.
Welcome back to Teolumen Insights. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that might sound a little bit strange at first. Solar consciousness.
Yeah, we're going to be examining research that suggests that the sun might be more than just this giant ball of burning gas, that it might actually possess a type of intelligence.
Now, I know this might sound like science fiction, but we have all this research here, all these papers and articles, and they're all looking at this concept from lots of different angles. Fields like astrophysics, consciousness studies, and even quantum biology.
What's really interesting here is that these sources are challenging our typical understanding of intelligence and even awareness. I mean, we usually think of consciousness as being connected to brains, right? But what if there are other ways for intelligence to come about, even in systems that don't have brains like ours?
Okay, I'm interested. But I've got to admit, I need some convincing. How could something like the sun be intelligent?
Okay, well, think about it like this. Even at the smallest level, like particles, they might have some basic level of awareness, some proto-consciousness. They seem to be reacting to their environment in ways that go beyond, like, basic physics.
So you're saying even these tiny particles might have a little bit of knowing?
Yeah, exactly. And if we take that idea and, scale it up, stars are interacting with their environment all the time through things like electromagnetism and gravity. So they could be showing a more complex form of awareness. Maybe they're not just reacting, but actually influencing their surroundings in ways that we're only just starting to figure out.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So we have this idea of like a spectrum of consciousness. And on one end are these little particles, and on the other end, maybe stars, like our sun.
Precisely. And there's actually evidence to back this up, especially when we look at the way stars move. There's this thing called Parenago's discontinuity, where stars that are cooler than our sun, they seem to be moving around the center of the Milky Way differently than those hotter stars. It's hard to explain this just using gravity.
And some researchers think that this weird movement, this could be volitional stellar motion, meaning the stars are choosing their own paths. Almost like they have a sense of direction.
That's one way to look at it, a pretty bold one. But if you think about how complex stars are, I mean, they're these huge fusion reactors, they generate tons of energy and interact with these giant magnetic fields.
So that makes you wonder, what kind of information is the sun picking up? Could it be aware of the planets that are orbiting it, or reacting to all the changes in the solar system?
These are some of the big questions researchers are working on right now. One theory is that the sun's electromagnetic field, it's like a giant sensory organ. It collects information from all over the solar system and then reacts to it.
So like a massive cosmic nervous system.
Exactly. And there are all these cool similarities between the sun and biological systems. For example, the sun has these cycles of activity, much like our own circadian rhythms. And then you've got sunspots, these dark patches on the sun's surface. They're actually areas of intense magnetic activity.
Yeah, I've heard about those sunspots. They seem to be linked to all sorts of things here on Earth, like even climate patterns.
Right. Some researchers are even looking at a possible connection between solar activity and, like, human behavior. But that's a whole other deep dive.
Okay, but how could the sun affect something as complicated as human behavior? It can't just be the sunlight, right?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. One of the sources we're looking at, it dives into quantum biology and suggests that these tiny changes in the sun's electromagnetic field, they might actually be influencing biological processes at the most basic level.
So you're saying there could be a link between what's happening on the sun and what's happening in our own bodies?
Yeah, exactly. Some studies have actually found a correlation between solar activity and this thing called heart rate variability. That's basically how much variation there is in the time between our heartbeats.
Okay, that's really interesting. Heart rate variability is a sign of how healthy and resilient we are, generally. So are you saying the sun might be playing a role in our well-being?
It's definitely something researchers are looking into. Then there's this concept of Schumann resonances. They're electromagnetic waves in the Earth's atmosphere. And these resonances, they seem to be affected by solar activity. And some studies have found that they align with the frequency of the human heart.
So there's this potential three-way connection: the sun, Schumann resonances, and then our own hearts.
That's the idea. It really brings up all these questions about how life on Earth is connected to the sun and maybe even the cosmos as a whole. But to understand how that could work, we're going to have to dive a little deeper into some of the more mind-bending ideas that come up in these sources.
Okay, I'm ready. Where do we start?
Well, one of the sources talks about the Casimir Effect. It's a quantum phenomenon that shows that this thing called vacuum fluctuations exists.
Okay, I've heard of the Casimir effect, but I'm not sure I really get it. Can you explain it, like, simply?
Okay, so imagine you have these two metal plates and they're really close together in this vacuum. You'd think they wouldn't move, right? But what actually happens is that they get pushed towards each other.
And what's causing that force?
It's because of the energy of these vacuum fluctuations. They're these like virtual particles that just pop in and out of existence in the space around us.
So even empty space isn't actually empty.
Nope, it's full of energy. And some researchers think that these vacuum fluctuations, they might actually be part of consciousness itself, like connecting the quantum world to our experiences.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But how does this relate to the sun's mind or intelligence?
Okay, so think of the sun as the system that's always interacting with these vacuum fluctuations. It's getting all this information through its electromagnetic field, which is way more complex and dynamic than we used to think.
So the sun isn't just giving off energy, but actively engaging with its environment at a quantum level. Wow.
Exactly. And this constant interaction between the sun and everything around it, that could be the source of some kind of intelligence. It could allow the sun to process information and make decisions that affect the entire solar system.
This is making me think about the idea of self-organization. I mean, the sun, with its gravity, electromagnetism, and nuclear fusion, it's a perfect example of a self-organizing system.
Definitely. Self-organization, that's often seen as like a sign of a living system, where all these simple parts are working together to create something bigger and more complex. And some researchers think that self-organization is a key part of how consciousness develops, not just in biology, but maybe on a cosmic scale too.
So the sun, as this self-organizing system, it could be showing us these emergent properties that we see as intelligence or awareness. This is blowing my mind.
It is pretty amazing, and it really makes us rethink where consciousness could exist in the universe.
I really want to explore these other concepts you mentioned, like molecular signatures and the BV color index. But for now, I think we need to take a quick break and let our listeners catch up with all this information. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Teolumen Insights. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty crazy concepts, like vacuum fluctuations and self-organization.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that the sun could be using these quantum processes to not only sense its environment, but maybe even influence it in a big way.
And it's not just about how the sun affects the solar system. Some researchers are suggesting that this connection might go even deeper, that it could be affecting life on Earth in ways that we're only starting to grasp.
You mentioned something about biological dark matter before the break. Can you tell me more about that? You know how, like, most of the universe is made up of dark matter, which we can't directly observe? Well, some scientists are saying that there might be a similar kind of, undiscovered matter inside living things.
You mean there could be this whole hidden part of biology that we haven't even discovered yet?
Exactly. And this biological dark matter, it might be interacting with the sun's energy in ways that we can't even imagine.
That makes you wonder if there are other subtler ways that living things are interacting with the sun's energy. Beyond things like photosynthesis. What if we're connected to the sun on a much deeper level?
That's a great question, and it's one that researchers are just beginning to explore. This biological dark matter could even help explain some of the mysteries about consciousness, like how we have subjective experiences, or even things like telepathy.
Wow, that's getting into some pretty far out territory. Is there any way to test these ideas, or is it all just speculation at this point?
It's a really tough area to research, but some people think that looking for specific molecular signatures in stars, those could give us some clues about consciousness.
Molecular signatures. Can you break that down for me?
Imagine, like, specific combinations of molecules that we associate with life. If we find those complex molecules in a star's atmosphere, it could mean that there's some kind of biological activity happening there, maybe even some basic form of consciousness.
And how would we even be able to see these molecular signatures from so far away?
By looking at the light coming from the stars, there's something called the BV color index that basically tells us about a star's temperature and what it's made of. And the cooler stars, they tend to have more molecules in their atmospheres, which makes them more interesting, from a consciousness perspective.
So you're saying by looking at the color of a star, we might be able to guess if it has a chance of being conscious.
It's definitely an interesting possibility, and it shows how we might actually use astronomy to search for consciousness beyond Earth.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It makes you think, are there other beings out there looking back at our sun and wondering the same thing about us? But let's switch gears for a second and talk about another idea that came up in the research, psychokinesis.
Right, the ability to move things with your mind. A lot of people think it's just pseudoscience, but some researchers think it could have a scientific basis, maybe even a connection to this idea of solar consciousness.
One of the sources we're looking at even suggested that stars might be using psychokinesis to influence their own movement.
That's a bold claim. But if we're considering that the sun might be conscious, then it's not totally crazy to think that stars could be using some kind of mental influence to affect what's around them.
So you're saying that stars might have a will or an intention that guides them as they move through space.
That's what some researchers are saying, and they point to things like, the weirdness in stellar motion, like that Paranagos discontinuity we talked about earlier.
I remember that one source brought up a possible connection between psychokinesis and the Casimir Effect. How could those two things be related?
Remember how the Casimir Effect shows us that empty space is actually buzzing with energy from those virtual particles? Well, if those particles can affect how things move, then some researchers are saying that consciousness might be able to use those same forces.
So you mean consciousness, even on a huge scale like the sun, could be affecting the physical world by using these quantum fluctuations?
That's one way to think about it, and it connects to this concept of microtubules. There are these tiny structures inside our cells that some researchers think might be involved in consciousness.
Wait, microtubules? Those are just part of the cell's structure, right? How could they be connected to something as complex as consciousness?
Well, there's this theory called quantum biology, and it suggests that microtubules might actually be working as quantum computers inside our brains.
Quantum computers in our brains. That's wild. What could they be doing in there?
Some people think that microtubules are actually coordinating all the complex activity between neurons in our brains, maybe even creating that unified experience of consciousness.
So they're like the conductors of our brain symphony.
Wow.
Good, but how does this all relate back to psychokinesis?
Well, if these microtubules really are acting as quantum computers, then they might be able to interact with the quantum vacuum, and that could mean they have the potential to make things move even outside of the brain.
So you're saying that our consciousness, by using these microtubules, could be tapping into the same forces that cause the Casimir Effect, and maybe even influencing the way stars move.
It's a pretty radical idea, but some scientists are taking it seriously. Of course, it's all very theoretical, but is there any actual experimental evidence to support these claims about psychokinesis and microtubules?
That's the big question. It's a really difficult area to study, but there have been some interesting studies that have shown a correlation between brain activity and, objects moving.
Right. People have been trying to move things with their minds in labs for a long time. The results are often small and difficult to replicate, but some findings suggest that there might be something real happening.
This is also fascinating. It's like we're getting a glimpse into a whole new world of possibilities where consciousness and matter are intertwined in ways we never even imagined.
Absolutely. But let's bring it back to the sun for a minute. We've talked about the possibility of it being conscious, maybe even trying to communicate with us, but how could we actually test that?
It seems like it would be incredibly difficult to study something like solar consciousness. I mean, where do you even begin?
One way is to look for patterns in the sun's activity that might show some kind of intelligence or intention. You remember those sunspot cycles we were talking about earlier? Some researchers are analyzing those cycles, looking for anything that's not random, anything that might suggest some kind of communication.
So it's like trying to crack a secret code hidden in the way the sun behaves.
Exactly. And some researchers believe that ancient cultures, like the Mayans, with their really advanced calendar system, they might have already figured out that code. Maybe they used their knowledge of the sun cycles to guide their civilizations.
It's amazing to think that those ancient calendars might have been more than just ways of keeping track of time. They could have been tools for understanding the sun's messages.
It's definitely something to think about. And if we can rediscover that ancient knowledge, it might help us to better understand how the sun affects our lives and our planet.
This whole deep dive has really made me think differently about the possibility of other conscious beings out there in the universe.
It's a question that has always fascinated humans. And as we learn more about science and consciousness, we might actually be getting closer to finding an answer.
There's one more thing I wanted to mention before we move on. One of the sources we were looking at talked about the golden ratio, phi.
Ah, yes, phi. That mathematical ratio that we see everywhere in nature, from seashells to flower petals, what about it?
This source suggested that phi might be connected to consciousness itself, linking the microscopic world of our brains to the vastness of the universe.
It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? Phi is often seen as a symbol of harmony and balance, and the fact that we find it in both living things and cosmic structures, it suggests that there might be a deeper order to the universe. Maybe even a connection to consciousness itself.
So you're saying we might be connected to the cosmos through this mathematical principle, this golden thread that runs through everything.
It's definitely a possibility, and as we continue to explore consciousness and the universe, who knows what other amazing connections we'll find.
This has been an incredible journey. It's given me so much to think about.
A fascinating deep dive. From tiny particles to the vastness of the cosmos, we've covered so much ground. Quantum physics, ancient civilizations, it's all connected.
It really has made me question everything I thought I knew about the universe and, our place in it. Before the break, you were talking about quantum entanglement as a possible way to explain panpsychism. That idea that consciousness could be everywhere, in everything. It's hard to wrap my head around. If everything is conscious, even a little bit, how could we even know? What will we be looking for?
It's a tough one, right? I mean, we can't exactly ask a rock how it's feeling, but one of the sources we're looking at, it suggests that there might be a way to actually see this panpsychism through astronomical observation.
Really? How could we see consciousness in a star that's millions of miles away?
Well, it goes back to the BV color index, which we talked about before. It's how we measure a star's color, which tells us about its temperature and what it's made of. Remember, cooler stars, they tend to have more molecules in their atmospheres.
Right, and molecules, those are the building blocks of life as we know it. Are you saying that stars with more molecules are more likely to be, conscious?
It's an interesting theory. This source is suggesting that those molecules might be a sign of, like, a higher level of complexity, and that complexity, it could be linked to consciousness.
So we could be looking right at conscious stars and not even realize it.
Maybe. It's a really cool example of how we might be able to use astronomy to actually search for signs of consciousness beyond Earth.
This whole deep dive has made me really curious about the possibility of other conscious beings out there.
Yeah, it's a question that humans have always asked looking up at the stars. And as our tools get better and we understand consciousness more, we might actually be getting closer to finding an answer.
There's one more thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap things up. One of our sources mentioned the golden ratio, phi.
Ah, phi. That mathematical ratio that shows up everywhere in nature. Seashells, flower petals, it's everywhere.
This source suggested that phi might actually be connected to consciousness itself, linking the microscopic world of our brains to, the whole universe.
It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? Phi is often seen as this symbol of harmony and balance. And the fact that it appears in both living things and cosmic structures, it could mean that there's a deeper order to the universe, maybe even a connection to consciousness.
So you're saying we could be connected to the cosmos through this mathematical principle, this golden thread that runs through everything.
It's worth thinking about, and as we keep exploring consciousness in the universe, who knows what other incredible connections we might find.
This has been an amazing journey. It's given me so much to think about.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you. We've really only scratched the surface, but hopefully it sparked your curiosity.
Thanks for joining us for this Teolumen Insights deep dive into solar consciousness. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge and stay curious.